Dorothy Puente was a Sacramento boarding house owner who was believed to have murdered around 9 people between 1982 and 1988. She targeted highly vulnerable tenants, including the elderly, disabled, and mentally ill individuals. Puente had a long history of fraud and theft before the murders, often drugging people to steal their money, and she carried that pattern into her boarding house. Her first known victim, Ruth Monroe, a 61-year-old woman, died in 1982 from what was initially ruled a drug overdose, but was later determined to be homicide. Over the next several years, multiple tenants disappeared, especially in 1987, including victims like Benjamin Fink, Vera Faye Martin, Dorothy Miller, and Leona Carpentier. She killed by drugging her victims with sedatives, causing fatal overdoses, then buried their bodies in her yard while continuing to cash their Social Security checks. Her crimes were discovered in November 1988 after a social worker reported 52-year-old Alvaro Bert Montoya missing. When police searched her property, they uncovered 7 bodies buried in the yard. Puente was arrested on November 16, 1988, charged with 9 murders and later convicted of 3 due to limited evidence in some cases. She was sentenced to life in prison and died in 2011. Her case stands out because of how calculated and financially motivated the crimes were, as well as her deliberate targeting of people who were less likely to be noticed if they disappeared. We will now move on to the video.
Dorothea Puente ran a boarding house in Sacramento, California, where she preyed on the elderly and disabled. She would offer rooms to vulnerable people and then sign their Social Security checks over to herself.
First thing I want to point out is the fact that Dorothy is in a position where she's trusted by so many people. Now, never in a million years did these people nor their families think that they were going to be scammed by someone who looks like grandma. Let alone, why would elderly people think that they're getting scammed by someone who's elderly themselves? These things just don't cross your mind because this is not the typical serial killer.
After being caught with that scam, she came up with a new plan to steal people's money. This is Monsters. Dorothea Puente had a troubling past. Her parents were both alcoholics who spent all of their money on booze. They were both dead by the time she was 9 years old, and she was placed into an orphanage where she was sexually abused.
One thing I do want to point out is throughout this entire story, not only are the victims failed, but Dorothy herself was also failed by a system that she was supposed to be able to trust. No kid should ever have to experience the things that Dorothy went through. I would like to point out that 100% of female serial killers that we know have reported that they experienced psychological, physical, or sexual abuse. And I know it's kind of like, you know, if we know these things, why don't we focus on the people that report this kind of abuse, right? Like maybe we could intervene, maybe we could change the trajectory of their lives, maybe they won't go on to be serial killers. Well, from what we know, all female serial killers, 100% of them have reported this kind of abuse, right? But not everyone who reports this abuse goes on to be a serial killer. You know, that it's kind of like, what can we really do about it to prevent things like this happening? You know what I mean? It's just so rare and so uncommon.
Eventually, relatives from Fresno, California took her in. In 1945, at 16 years old, Puente married her first husband, Fred McFowell. The couple had 2 daughters, one who was sent to live with family in Sacramento, and the other who was put up for adoption. McFowell left her in 1948, and she was embarrassed about being rejected, so she would lie and say that her husband died of a heart attack. Once on her own, she started forging checks to get by, but was caught in the early 50s and sentenced to 1 year in prison. She was released after 6 months, and soon after married a man named Axel Johansson. She stayed married to Johansson for 14 years, and the relationship was known to be violent. Court records show that Johansson had his wife committed to a mental hospital in 1961, where she was prescribed antipsychotic medication. In 1960, Puente operated...
So I have one question. Was she really insane? Was she actually mentally ill? Or did her parents die when she was 9? Was she just sexually abused by people that she was supposed to trust? Like, there's so many things that happened to her. I don't think that she was mentally ill. I think she just needed some help, but not in a way that she's crazy. She just needed someone to care. I get she was stealing money to get by, but look at how she grew up. How was that her fault? Look at the kind of life she lived. She didn't get to choose that.
At a brothel, for which she was arrested and sentenced to 90 days in jail. After her release, she was arrested again for vagrancy and sentenced to another 90 days. Her criminal activities slowed down as she found work as a nurse's aide, caring for disabled and elderly people in their homes. In 1966, at 37 years old, she divorced Johansson and married 18-year-old Roberto Puente. The young man wasn't able to stay faithful, and the marriage only lasted 2 years. It's said that his main interest in marrying Dorothea was to gain U.S. citizenship. About the same time she got divorced, Puente took over control of a large 16-bedroom care home at 2100 F Street in Sacramento. Over the next 10 years, Puente's boarding house did well, and it's attributed to her making donations to political campaigns and charitable causes. Because of this, she had access to elite circles and is known to have spent time with California governors Pat Brown, Jerry Brown, and Ronald Reagan.
See, and this is exactly why she was able to get away with what she did for so long. No one could ever think that someone like her would do all the horrific things she would end up committing.
She also developed strong relationships with local social workers. They were happy to use her services since she was willing to board alcoholics and drug addicts.
Again, look at the people that she's boarding. You think people care what happens to those people? Probably not if they're in a boarding home and not living with their family. This was the perfect opportunity for her.
She married for the fourth and final time in 1976 to a man named Pedro Montalvo. Montalvo was a violent alcoholic, and the relationship only lasted a few months. Once her final husband was out of the picture, Puente started hanging out at local bars, meeting older men who received benefits, then forging their signatures and stealing their money. She was caught in the act but only received 5 years of probation. This sentence also barred her from operating the boarding house, so she started working as an in-home caregiver. While doing this, she would drug her patients and steal their valuables. At this time, she also started renting out an apartment on the second floor of her home, which was located just down the street from the boarding house. It wasn't until she started renting out this apartment that things started getting deadly. Her first tenant, Ruth Monroe, died of an overdose of painkillers. Puente convinced the police that she had been depressed, so they ruled it a suicide. After that, Puente was arrested for her scam of drugging patients and stealing from them. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison. She would be released after 3 years, but while inside she had met a man named Everson Gilmuth. Gilmuth was a retiree who would write letters to women in prison. She developed a relationship with the man because she wanted someone she could scam as soon as she got out of prison. She got her wish when she was released from prison, and Gilmuth was waiting to pick her up in his red Ford pickup. Puente was evaluated by psychologists before being released from prison in 1985 and was diagnosed as schizophrenic. The psychologist wrote, quote, "This woman is a disturbed woman who does not appear to have remorse or regret for what she does."
And she was still released. They didn't put her in a psychiatric facility. They released her. And they called her dangerous.
She is to be considered dangerous, and her living environment and/or employment should be closely monitored. End quote. After.
Okay, so the video doesn't really say what happened. But she killed Gilmouth. Yeah, she killed him, and yeah, that's his truck. Yep, and she's about to sell that truck, if I'm not mistaken.
Her release, Puente hired a local handyman, Ismael Flores, to do some work around her house. She had him install some wood paneling at her house, and she was also able to sell him a red Ford pickup that she had recently acquired. After that, she asked Flores to build her a wooden chest to use for storage. She wanted it to be 6 feet long, 3 feet wide.
And he said yes, by the way. This Flores guy, like, Like, Dorothy's like, yeah, can you build me this thing? I just need it for storage. It's a coffin. It looks like a coffin. It's the dimensions of a coffin, and he still does it. I don't get it. I really don't. I think by him doing this and not speaking out, man, the blood of her next victims definitely on his hands. I think there was a lot of signs there, and he should have definitely said something.
Wide and 2 feet deep. Flores agreed and had it finished by the next day. Puente used the box to dispose of Gilmuth's body, though she continued to collect his pension. On January 1st, 1986, a fisherman spotted the box partially submerged in the water and notified the police. When they opened the box, they found the decaying remains of an elderly man in nothing but underwear. It would be 3 years before they identified the remains as those of Everson Gilmuth. A social worker eventually reported one of her case subjects missing to the police. The disabled man, named Alberto Montoya, was referred to Puente to board at her house. The police, led by homicide detective John Cabrera, searched her house but didn't find anything incriminating. The grandmotherly woman maintained that her tenant had taken a trip to Utah, and when the investigator asked if they could dig up some freshly disturbed soil in her yard, she even let them borrow a shovel.
If she wasn't who she was, and if she didn't look like what she looked like, if anyone else said one of their tenants just took a trip, yeah, no, they are gonna get investigated. Yeah, right away.
While the police were digging, they uncovered remains buried on the property. When they showed Puente what they found, she seemed genuinely surprised, which investigators now know is due to her lifetime of being a con artist.
When I was trying to figure out her archetype, I had a hard time because now I thought the Omega archetype was probably the best one. She exemplified the detachment. She has great deception. And just the fact that oh my gosh, what was I gonna? She's very self-centered, right? She definitely has very little compassion and empathy. But this archetype states that usually these serial killer archetypes, like, they use sex or eroticism to gain leverage. She definitely wasn't sexually proactive or anything like that, right? So the archetype doesn't really explain that. But if I had to pick an archetype, it's this one.
Since the remains looked to have been there much longer than Montoya had been missing, they were skeptical that this white-haired little lady could be a murderer. They took her to the police station for questioning, but she remained calm and unflinching. The investigators sent her home for the evening. The next morning, more authorities arrived to continue searching her property. Before they started, Puente asked Detective Cabrera if she was under arrest. When they said no, she asked if she could go down the street for some coffee. Authorities agreed, and she left the property.
Only because she's an elderly woman, right? She ran a boarding home. She was a nurse's aide. She has a very credible resume, right? But because of all of these things, look at how she's getting treated by the police. Had anyone else been like, yo, like, am I under arrest, right? Yeah, they're probably going to say no, right? But they're not going to let you leave the scene of the crime, right? You're probably going to get detained.
What they didn't know at the time was that she had about $2,500 stuffed into her oversized purse. It was only 21 minutes later that they uncovered a second set of remains. Police officers raced down the street to arrest Puente, but she was gone. Cabrera was the victim of her most recent con. Puente fled to Los Angeles, where she kept a low profile at a downtown hotel that she checked into under the name Dorothea Johansson. Falling back onto her old tricks, she headed to a bar and befriended an elderly pensioner. Unfortunately for her, the man recognized her from a television report and he notified the police. She was quickly arrested. The elderly woman sat in jail while police worked to identify the bodies that had been buried on her property. They uncovered 7 bodies, 4 women and 3 men. In 1992, Dorothea Puente was charged with 9 murders. She was charged with the murder for the 7 people found buried on her property, for the murder of Everson Gilmuth, and for the murder of Alvaro Gonzalez. The jury found her guilty of 3, but couldn't come to a decision on the other 6. On December 11, 1993, Dorothea Puente was given 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole. Once the verdict was read, Puente turned to her lawyer and said, quote, "I didn't kill anyone," end quote. She spent the rest of her life insisting that all of the tenants found on her property had died of natural causes. She died of natural causes in prison in 2011. She was 82 years old.
That was an incredible video, and this was definitely one of the most interesting cases I've ever heard of. In my experience, this is the first case where the offender was like the victim. An elderly woman killing elderly people. That's just not something that you hear about. On a serious note, we need to do better as a society. She was failed by her parents. She was failed by the foster system. And she was failed by pretty much everybody who she should have been able to trust. And to make matters worse, the criminal justice system definitely failed a lot of the victims that she killed because of who she was, because of what she looked like. She wasn't taken seriously as a suspect of any of these crimes. We need to stop focusing on who we believe is the picture perfect offender. We need to start looking at everybody. We need to stop making assumptions. We just have to do better as a whole society. Yeah, I actually do feel really bad for Dorothy. You know, I know most people don't care about her, but you know, she was also a victim, and she was failed miserably. So I feel very sorry for her. You know, I really hope in the future of serial homicide we're able to find out how we could intervene and prevent these kinds of things from happening.